Hello, I'm Sidney Porter representing the Health Physics Society History Committee, and it's my pleasure to be interviewing Roger Granlund. Roger is one of our senior health physicists that has a wealth of experience, and I'm looking forward to Roger hearing about these many projects that you've worked on over the years, and also about an awful lot of your students. You've had an awful lot of students that have come through your program over the years too. And I hope also that you talk a little bit about your son, who I think is a very fine health physicist and somebody that you should be proud of. But Roger has been a health physicist since the early days of the AEC program. And Roger, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you started in health physics?
Okay, well, I got started. I was a chemistry student at Penn State, and I took a course in radiochemistry in my junior year. It was a senior graduate student course, and it was one of the courses that I enjoyed most. And of course, atomic energy was an exciting field at that time, so it was an area that showed a lot of promise, and I was very interested in it. The instructor for the course was Warren Miller. He had been a chemist for the Manhattan Project. Came to Penn State and set up this radiochemistry course. I think the year I took it was the second year it was offered. His assistant, by the way, was a young man named Lloyd Curry, which you know later went on to NIST and is famous for the statistical work that he did there. But he was a radiochemist. Well, in my senior year, when it came time to decide what I was going to do when I left school, I noticed one of the ads for the AEC fellowship program in health physics, and that sounded interesting. I had pretty much decided I didn't want to go to graduate school in chemistry, although I had an opportunity to go to the Institute of Paper Chemistry, Appleton, Wisconsin, which is a very good physical chemistry school, and work on a graduate program there. That had come about because I had worked summers in the paper mill in Johnsonburg, Pennsylvania, where I grew up, and had an opportunity to start in high school working as a janitor there, and eventually worked up to my summers in college. I was fortunate enough to get a job there working in the lab. And between that summer work and a few scholarships I had, that was enough to put me through school, because at that time there wasn't any other funding for it. So I decided to apply for this AEC fellowship, and got it. I chose Vanderbilt because the summer program was at Oak Ridge, and that sounded like the best summer program that was available, and I didn't have any reason to doubt that I'd make a wrong decision there. The Vanderbilt physics program, actually, I didn't think was that great as far as health physics go. They had a radiochemistry program, and which a person was teaching for the first time. He actually used my notes from Penn State as a background for it. They had no radiobiology. It was taught by a physics professor who hadn't had any biology experience. We all went out and bought a college outline series in biology, and that was it. But the good part of the program was the instruction. Myron Fair and Elda Anderson came over from Oak Ridge and actually taught the health physics portion of the program. And we had a couple of visits from Casey Morgan at the same time.
But Elda was a gifted teacher, I'm told.
Yeah, she did a very good job. Myron Fair was actually taught most of the course, and he was excellent. And Elda did also a lot of the seminars and meetings and stuff we had during the summer program at Oak Ridge. But they did an excellent job in teaching the health physics portion of the program. So the tie-in with Oak Ridge was very good. And the best part of it was the summer program. I just loved that. getting.
What did you do there?
Well, you rotated. You actually worked shift work with the health physics staff, and you rotated between the production areas, the isotope production, the research groups. So you had about a week in each of the different areas. And I still remember my first the first assignment I had was to the X10 pile, and I was on night shift, and the task we had for that night was to do a neutron survey of one of the ports where they took samples out of the X10 pile. And the technician that I worked with was Paul Zemer.
Oh.
Paul had gone through the program the year before and stayed on to work as a technician. And I still remember the instruments we used, which were 2 Landsberg electrometers. One, I think, was boron lined and the other plain, so one was sensitive to neutrons. But you can imagine we set these up where we wanted to take the survey, started them up, backed off, and 10 minutes later you came back and looked at the electroscope, and then you moved on to the next point. So doing a survey with a number of points could take several hours.
You didn't have one heavily moderated one for energy newts to bring the energy down?
No, there were just 2 of them, and I think I don't remember correctly, but I think that we had one that was boron line, which would have been, well, that would have been also a thermal neutron one. So anyhow, that was an interesting place. We got to go into the hot cell areas where they did the production, neutron separation, spent some time in the waste disposal. Back in those days they were doing deep well injection. Don Jacobs and other people were working at the place. John Oxier, John Thorngate, others were working.
Fred Haywood?
Fred Haywood.
Did you do dosimetry with those guys?
No, they were there. I stayed on I got an extension to stay on during that winter and work on a research project. And they were in the same building. We worked in the HP research building there. But I got to see them every day. I mean, we were just the door.
And what was your project for the winter?
My project was working under Sam Hurst, looking at the statistics of multiplication of electrons in proportional counters. So I had a device set up where we could introduce a single electron into a proportional counter and then look at the pulse size coming off to look at the statistics of multiplication. I used a 20-channel multi-channel analyzer, except that it was 20 separate amplifiers, all tube type. They had to be all set up and adjusted every day before you started. They had binary scalars on them with electromagnetic counters at the end of the scalars. So I started out with that, at that time I thought was a pretty sophisticated piece of equipment.
Well, for that year, when was this? Late?
This would
50s?
be 1959 and 1960.
Yeah, it was very sophisticated. 20-channel analyzer?
Yeah.
There were very few of them around.
Most places didn't even know what a multi-channel analyzer was.
Exactly.
I know for when I went to work for years, we used a single-channel analyzer with a motor drive and a chart recorder to do our spectral and gamma spectrum analysis. Also in the same building, Casey Morgan, who was in charge of health physics, was working there. Walter Snyder, Mary Jane Cook, they were all working hard at that time on the first ICRP-2 report, internal dosimetry report. Remember, we felt fortunate we got Xerox copies of the first draft of that report.
That was actually published as a NCRP handbook in '68.
Yeah, I'm trying to think.
And I'm not sure when I remember the ICRP-2.
Was that handbook 69?
Yeah, it was handbook 69, and it was in '68 it first came out. And I'm trying to think, the ICRP version of it, when that came out, that was a hardback. I remember
Yes.
that was a hardback.
Yes. But I know in
Killing
Xerox form it was about 2 inches thick. Not Xerox then, it was mimeograph. We didn't have Xerox then. So they
had the purple mimeograph.
Yeah. But those were.
But that was quite an exciting thing.
Well, those were interesting times. You know, the dosimetry for the Japanese survivors was the time when they were doing the original dosimetry. Joe Chekai had set up a table, a large table in one of the rooms, and he had models of Japanese houses, and they had a light source with a grid on it. So they could set that up, and it would project this grid to give them the angles at various places. They would, use the light source as the neutron source or the gamma ray source to show how it came down on these models of these Japanese houses there. And they were doing the original dosimetry.
Now, did you do any of the work? I first met Fred Haywood and Johnny Oaks here, both actually, out at NRTS. At Area 500 where they had the Brennan Tower.
And no, I wasn't associated with any of the dosimetry.
And they put this huge Cockcroft-Walton accelerator up there with a 5,000 curie tritium source, and used the Cockcroft-Walton as a source of deuterons. And they made this a big DT machine. And that's how they got the 14 MeV newts to do the actual dosimetry down on the ground.
Well, at that time,
that thing was the third again higher than the Empire State Building.
I think that was before. That came after the time I was there, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, that was in the
that would be in the 60s.
Middle 60s, I guess.
Yeah.
Early.
When I was there,
60s.
they had the Hearst counter, the plastic line proportional counter. And essentially that's what I was working on, was to look at the statistical variation and see how that affected. The Hearst counter was basically a 4-channel, I think it was 4-channel neutron counter. And with normalization to give them what we would call today a dose effective, dose equivalent out of the thing. So those were interesting times. At that time, John Oxier and the rest of them were just young guys out working their tails off, trying to get started in the field. But that's where all the old timers started. At that time, they were just starting out in that field. So it was an interesting time for us.
Now, did you go to Penn State right after that?
Yeah, I interviewed for 2 jobs when I left there. One was at University of Virginia and one was at Penn State. And I had graduated from Penn State in '58. And I had done my senior project at the reactor. I had made a Compton detector.
Compton scatter?
No, Compton electron detector. We basically look at Compton electrons and measure the current through those, which was pretty crude because I made it using, I had to buy my own equipment, which is a few plastic plates and a few connectors and so forth at the equivalent of Radio Shack. I think Allied Radio was where I sent off to get those. And they supplied an electrometer for that thing, and I did my senior project there. So I was familiar with the reactor facility. And so I decided to go back to Penn State, and I never really regretted that. At times it was you wished you could be out with some of those exciting things that were going on with the bomb testing and others, but the university environment suited me very well because you could work on your own. You could do lots of different things. There weren't any big projects there, but you could do basic health physics of all different kinds. And I was sort of a junk collector. We had a surplus and salvage group there where you could go and get all this government surplus stuff. And I had tons of that stuff in the lab. I had a drill press and a lathe, and if we needed something, I'd just go in and make up something that would do the job that we needed. So we could measure liquid, gaseous samples, and most anything that was required, we could, with a little bit of time something up to do the job. So he didn't have much in the way of fancy equipment. University budgets weren't for that, but managed to do a lot of...
We had plenty of manpower in order to put things together.
And there was a lot of interesting projects, and that I enjoyed doing that kind of thing. So we did more of that than a lot of programs had.
Well, I noticed that when you went to work at Penn State, you were interviewed by some pretty famous people.
Well, they weren't famous then, but I actually was interviewed by Joe Palladino for the job. Joe was in charge of nuclear engineering department at Penn State at that time. And one of the graduate students who was at the reactor when I was there as a chemistry major was Forrest Remy. When I went back, Forrest had gotten his degree and was then in charge of the reactor. So, and those gentlemen both went on to become NRC commissioners. Joe was chair.
Did Joe chair it?
He was chair of the NRC for a while. And Forrest Remy moved on from the reactor to become one of the associate vice presidents in the vice president for research, and was instrumental in getting the health physics program transferred from the University Health Center over to the vice president for research. And so that gave me pretty much freedom and access to the research program. And he was probably the one who was more responsible than anybody for me staying at Penn State, because it was a working environment that you couldn't get anyplace else. He was just an excellent administrator. So that was, I guess, one of the big pluses of working there was that I never really felt that I wanted to go anyplace else.
Yeah, it did become home for a few years, didn't it?
Yes, from 1960 through 1997.
Yes. And so, by the way, who was the university health physicist before you? I meant to ask you that.
Ed Kenny. He had gone through the Rochester program, and they had, because he was under the health center, and they decided that wasn't a good place, that they were going to put him under at that time, what was called a campus patrol, which was campus police services.
Security.
And it was headed by a retired Army colonel. And he and Ed Kenny just did not see fit. He was more interested in locks on doors and stuff like that, and nothing about health physics. And so Ed Kenny decided he was going to go over to the nuclear engineering department and work at the reactor. And so that's how the opening came up, which was fortunate for me. Ed Kenny and I were good friends. He still lives in State College, and I still see him. He's been retired for a number of years. But he went on to become a professor in nuclear engineering and stayed in the area.
Now, I understand that you weren't there too long before you had a pretty significant incident with some polonium.
Yeah, at one of the early on in the 60s, Penn State decided they wanted to institute a biophysics program. So they brought in a rather famous biophysicist from, I guess it was from Yale, and I won't mention names, but he was doing a radiation of bacteria and using an alpha source with which you could get very high radiation levels. Decided that it wasn't putting out enough alpha particles and took the stainless steel window off of this thing, which was against the license.
How large a source was it?
It was like 500 millicuries of polonium.
Well, that's big.
So that's a pretty good sized polonium source. And a lot of the polonium got out of the stuff. Unfortunately, he didn't do any surveying when they did this thing. So it came.
And there's such a recoil from polonium.
Yeah,
it's going
it
to move
tends
on its own.
It tends to move stuff on its own. So when I came to do the routine leak test and found contamination all over, we backtracked to see what had happened, reported it to the NRC, and took urine samples, and which was, by the way, where I learned how to do polonium-210 and self-deposition in urine. Turns out to be a very simple process, but works extremely well. Did the bioassays, didn't have any problem with it.
No body burdens?
No body burdens that we could see with that. So when they had pulled this thing off, he had, as a respirator, he had taken his handkerchief and tied it around his nose. Whether that did any good or not, I don't know. But at least we didn't see any uptake from it. So it was a reportable incident. The NRC sent some inspectors down, and I had to file a report on it. Instead of, in my lack of experience at these things, I wrote a report and put everybody's name in it instead of investigator A, B, and C. And this investigator was very upset about it. And I found out later he had tried to get me fired for this thing, and he was pretty high up on the ladder. But the Warren Miller, who I had mentioned before, who was chairman of the Idaho committee, wasn't going to let that happen, and so I stayed on. Later on, this investigator and I we worked together, and he later said about the time he retired that I had done a pretty good job, but I was a little bit too conservative for some of the things that he wanted to do. I might point out that he had worked with some of the early investigators in England with radium and polonium sources. So for him, it wasn't a big deal. He had worked, I think, in Rutherford or his lab or somebody over there.
Really? Really? Of course,
that would have been in the 1930s.
That was really early.
It would have been in the 1930s when he started working with these things.
Rutherford was up in Canada at McGill.
It's probably one of the other, and I don't remember one of the other.
Yeah. That's where in 1901 he published Radioactivity, and he was at McGill at that point. And I don't think he ever went. Did he go back to England?
I don't know.
I'm not so sure he did. Well, anyway.
Anyhow, that was an interesting incident.
Right now, apparently you were in charge of health physics program when you got offered the Qahana Facility for a very good price, I'm told.
Yeah. Nothing is a pretty good price, I guess.
And that's a multi-million-dollar facility.
Curtis Wright had built this facility. As a matter of fact, they were building it when I was an undergraduate student at Penn State, because I remember going through that area on my way home one time. And there was a lot of construction going on at that time. But they built a facility to do a number of things. Curtis Wright at that time was one of the manufacturers of jet engines. And so the state had leased them this site that's about 10 miles in diameter in the center of Pennsylvania, all wooded area.
It's a beautiful state park.
It's now a wilderness area. Yeah. Well, they had built a facility for beryllium research. They did plastic manufacturing, and they did testing of jet engines. They had pods set up in various areas, and they could run jet engines.
Didn't they have some of the AMP project also, Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Project?
Yeah, they were. I think they were tied in. They weren't doing that particular. They didn't have any nuclear engines there, but I think that was part of their long-term project. And so, as part of this facility, they had built this 1 megawatt pool-type MTR research reactor, and attached to that a large hot cell facility. And well, Curtis Wright, that program died, and they had no funding, so they just moved out. And for a couple of years, that whole facility just stood there in the wilderness. They decided that maybe Penn State could get some customers for them. So they turned it over to Penn State, and Penn State acted sort of as a landlord for it, and tried to get people interested in the facilities. I remember my first trip up there, the gates had been locked in this thing, so there was no traffic through it. And you had a road that went right through the center of this thing, 10 miles across, that had been built. Just a 2-lane macadam road, but on either side there was about a 50-foot area cleared. And this had grown up in grass. And it was a 10-mile long pasture for the deer. So I remember when we went through there, they opened the gate, we went in, we went about a mile or so inside, and then you'd find deer in the middle of the road. And it was like cattle out west. You sort of just had to drive between them. They wouldn't run off. They were so tame. They just had to bump them off to the sides as you went through. That changed quickly when they opened the site. Well, the customer that they found for it was Martin Marietta. And Martin Marietta used it to build snap generators. The snap generator was about a megacurie of strontium 90 titanate in the inside of a large shield, and they put the heat from that was used to produce electricity, and they could make generators which I think were a couple kilowatts, and they were enough. They were interested in using them in places like McGurgle Sound in Antarctica to operate weather stations, buoys out in the ocean, what have you, as a permanent power source. They were the forerunner of the snap generators that are used in the space program now, except that they use plutonium-238, so they can make much smaller. But it's kind of impressive when you see a cask about 2 feet in diameter and 3 feet high, and you put your hand against it, and it's like warm water, about 100 degrees or so, and you know that heat is being produced by the strontium-90 inside of it. So I was the HP for Penn State, and Penn State, Martin Marietta had their own health physics staff there. But we had the permit to release water to the stream, and so their wastewater, which ran through a purification system and an evaporator, I would analyze that, go get samples of that. We would analyze it and give them the release permission or not to get rid of that stuff. So, and then when that project was finally finished, we hadn't found any other customers for it, and so Penn State turned that the areas that they were responsible for back to the state of Pennsylvania, and I think it went into the Forest and Waters or something like that. Tom Jaruski and Jim from the state of Pennsylvania, Jim Bresson from the Atomic Energy Commission, and I went up when they finally did the final survey. This was done in one day. This is a decommissioning survey done in one day. And
when was that?
That was 1970s sometime, or late 60s. I don't remember the exact date. So we did basically contamination surveys, radiation surveys. Now, the thought was that somebody was eventually going to come in and use the facility again. So it was clean in those accessible areas. The hot cells had been cleaned and painted with the exception of the one that had the process equipment in it. There had been nothing done in the interior of the ventilation system. We knew those areas were contaminated, but they weren't going to clean them if somebody else was going to come in and do it. So it was turned over, and then later on, we had gotten rid of the reactor fuel, so I had a chance at that time to participate in getting rid of the fuel. We had to take and cut the ends off of the MTR elements because they wouldn't fit in the cask. And so we had an underwater saw that they used to clip the ends, the hanger, and there's a snout on the MTR elements about 6 inches long that fits into the grid plate. And cut those off so they would fit in the cask. And then had a big cask loaded, brought in, and loaded the fuel elements into those and shipped them off to probably Savannah River, because that was 90+% enrichment uranium fuel, 235 fuel. Did the same thing a little bit later. Penn State's had MTR fuel elements in their 200 kilowatt reactor, and we did the same process when they went to a trigger reactor and shipped that fuel off to Savannah River also. So even though it was university, you don't think of that. I had two core changes under my belt with the thing.
That's fascinating. Now, you also were working with a Cobalt facility too at Penn State?
Yeah, Penn State put in a Cobalt facility a few years after I got there, and we brought in, that was a pool type facility, and we brought in I think about 80,000 curies of Cobalt 60 from AECL. This was new stuff. Later on, after that had decayed 10 or 15 years, 2 or 3 half-lives, that was down pretty good. So at Natick Quartermaster Corps, the Army Quartermaster Corps in Natick, Massachusetts, had a big irradiator up there that they were using for things like food irradiation. And they decided to get rid of that and made it available, so we got 70 or 80,000 curies of that Cobalt, put it in the fuel. That's still in that Cobalt facility now. It's of course decayed down pretty much, and so they're using an AECL dry irradiator for most of the stuff that they do with it. So we had some work with the radiators. We also had 2 or 3 of the AECL irradiators for the campus labs that we're doing, biophysics and stuff, and those we eventually got rid of all of those. So I went through the shipping out of and decommissioning of 2 or 3 of the dry type self-shielded irradiators.
Okay, tell me about how did you get involved as RSO of Hershey Medical Center? Now, you were the first RSO here?
Yeah, Milton Hershey gave Penn State something like $50 million, if I remember correctly, to build a medical school. And they built the school here in late 1960s. They, of course, was a research medical center, and they worked under our University Park license for a number of years. And I had a technician here. I would come down about once a week or so and go over the program, and they operated. The researchers went through our University ISTA committee.
So were there many, when it first started, roughly how many research labs did you have?
I would guess that probably 5 or 6 research labs here when they first started. It wasn't a big operation. They eventually wanted to go to nuclear medicine and also start doing research projects involving human subjects. And our license didn't cover that. So something that it would be very hard pressed to do today, I wrote up the license for it, drove down here one afternoon to Hershey Medical Center, got the chairman of the ISTO committee to sign off on the thing. I drove down to Bethesda that night, early the next morning, 8:30 or so. I was in the NRC's office in Bethesda, where they were located at that time. Handed the application over to, I think the reviewer at that time in charge of medical stuff was Boyer, I can't remember his first name. And he started to review it. I came back about 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He had finished reviewing it, gotten all the sign-offs in Hershey, and I went back and dropped the license off at Hershey that day. So within 24 hours, we had gone from license application to approved license.
That'll never happen again.
Probably not. They were very cooperative in getting that done for us.
Yeah, well, that's just amazing. How about tell me about some of the projects that you've enjoyed working on? I mean, there's one
I think
about being in the university.
Yeah, that's the nice thing about the university is there's such a wide variety of things that you can work on. And we've had engineering projects and all kinds of biology, biophysics, and so forth. I enjoyed, I think, most of the large animal projects. Penn State in Pennsylvania was rather noted for their research with white-tailed deer, funded by the Game Commission. And we had some people in animal nutrition who felt that the deer, because of the antler production, would be a good animal to study to look at the production of bone, because essentially a deer produces 4 or 5 pounds of bone in a matter of a few months. And so we did experiments with live white-tailed deer using P32 and calcium 45. Now, one of the things about deer is deer, goats, those kinds of animals, they're very wiry, very nervous, so they don't take well to tranquilizers. If you give them enough tranquilizer to make it work, it's very easy to overdose. And so in some cases, you had guys going into the cages and just grabbing a hold of the deer, and one guy on the neck and one guy on each leg, and put it down, and then somebody's injecting with a couple millicuries of P32. And I, at times, would be monitoring the thing, but also at the same time holding on to a deer leg because of the number of people that were there. And we did this all without ever having any problems with it. No contamination problems, no dose to personnel, but it was exciting. We did work with goats and cows. I remember an experiment with growth hormone, using iodine-labeled growth hormone in cows. And this was a long-term experiment, a matter of a couple of weeks before the cow was going to be euthanized. And so we collected all of the waste from a full-size cow.
That's a
for
lot.
a period of several weeks, plus the carcass of the cow. And this was a double label experiment with iodine 131, which is not too bad. You only have to wait six months to get rid of that stuff. But it also had iodine 125 in it. And so we stored some of that waste for 3 years in a large freezer before we were able to get rid of it. So that was one of the other projects I remember was one of the problems with Hereford cattle is they get eye cancer. Apparently it's related to the coloration of the eye or something, but they get these small cancers right on the corner of the eye.
Just brachytherapy?
One of the vets came along and asked and said, is there any way we could treat those with radiation? And so I had never even heard of a strontium 90 eye applicator, and there was no way we were going to be able to afford one. So I did a little bit of reading on it, did some calculations, and remembered something that one of the radiochemists had told me about one time about gold 198 being a good beta source because you could make it in the reactor in large amounts. So I machined out a little holder, and we would irradiate pieces of gold foil. We had lots of gold foil because you use it for neutron dosimetry in the reactor. And you would irradiate one of these gold foils to get a couple hundred millicuries of gold 198, and then stick it on the end of this thing. And interesting part, we were doing this out in the field. So you go out in the field, you don't, in some cases you don't even anesthetize the animal other than a little bit of local. So you're taking the animal, the vet would tie the eyes open with a couple of stitches, the eyelid, so you couldn't close it. And then we had this irradiator on the end of a pole, and stick it up to the animal's eye. And then we did that for a number of animals. It worked fairly well, but it's probably the largest dose I have in my dose history. We never exceeded the limit, but a couple rads of extremity doses due to this thing. It's more than I've got for anything else in my career with those kinds of things.
So you also did some work at INEL. To tell me about that.
Well, as part of
Idaho nuclear.
Yeah, Idaho National Engineering
National
Lab.
Engineering
Yeah.
Labs. At Arco, Idaho, right?
Yeah, out at, I did consulting for a number of projects, and one of a couple of the projects that were very interesting involved waste solidification. And one of the people who lived in State College came to me, and he had bought a license for a waste solidification process that used cement, Portland cement, and liquid sodium silicate. It had been used for, he'd been using it for industrial waste, cleaning up petroleum plant lagoons and so forth. And he wanted to try this on nuclear waste. So I did some chemistry, and we made up solutions and mixes to do this. We started using it at Penn State, and it was kind of interesting because you could take a 55-gallon drum, put 40 gallons of liquid in it, and then add cement silicate to that, mix it up, and solidify 40 gallons of liquid within a 55-gallon drum, which was much more than you could with straight cement. And the other thing was this stuff would solidify in a matter of seconds after you mix in the sodium silicate. So he got contracts to do this at a number of places. One of those places was Idaho National Engineering Lab, and they had some underground tanks that had, I don't know, 20,000 gallons or so of liquid waste in them, and these tanks were getting old. So they wanted to solidify it and get it out of there. This waste was at the north end of the site where the old hot cell had been for the nuclear-powered aircraft project. I was told that even some of the original SL-1 accident waste had been put into those tanks because they'd used the hot cells and stuff for it. It was a fairly large project, and what they would do was bring the liquid up and put it in concrete tanks. And what they were using were essentially manholes, like you use in electric utilities. These were about 6 foot square and about 6 foot high manholes. They would pump that up, and we had a big mixer that they would lower on the top of these things with a crane, and then dump cement in by the bags and pump in the silicate, mix it up, and then move on to the next one. And they had purchased just about every concrete tank in the state of Idaho. We had these lined up in rows that were probably 200 or 300 feet long.
Wow.
And just went from one to the other and solidified that stuff. So it was a week-long, 24-hour-a-day project where we ran it. By the end of the week, you were just exhausted because you were working 16 hours and getting a couple hours sleep and starting all over again on this thing. But they were interesting projects. Also got to solidify a couple of fuel fabrication lagoons. Big lagoons, maybe half an acre in size, 5-6 feet deep, with the calcium fluoride sludge from the fuel fabrication, and mixed those up and had a continuous process, pumped it through essentially a rig on the back of a semi truck, which added cement, silicate as the stuff goes through, and put it out in the middle of a big pile. It's solidified, and after a couple of weeks you'd come by, you could take this stuff and put it on it was not very high activity. It had uranium in it, was the big problem. It'd come in with front-end loaders and load it up in trucks and take it to a barn or some waste disposal site for it.
So you had a lot of early on waste disposal experience then?
Yeah, one of the other waste disposal projects that I worked on was incineration of liquid scintillation fluid. It was back before we had commercial incinerators available, and so I started with experimenting with the oil burner off of a household oil furnace. A little tank, and we would take scintillation fluid and burn it. Worked my way up to an industrial burner that would burn several, probably 25 or 30 gallons an hour of liquid scintillation fluid that fed a crematory that we had for animals. So we built a blower, the burner, did all the fabrication of the fire brick and so forth for it. We had a burner that would run at a couple million BTUs per hour.
Wow.
With that. So we got rid of a lot of scintillation fluid with that. When the commercial Permafix and the other ones came along, it was cheaper to send your stuff off than to mess with separating it from vials and all the other things that were involved with it.
So you have one project that we have in common. I was up at Oyster Creek in the 70s about 4 times. And the 5th time they asked me to go, I refused. But anyway,
yes,
when were you there?
I did QA audits there, and that would probably be in the 80s, I think, sometime.
Okay, they were having, when I was there, huge problems with management. And even so, there were real health physics problems. My estimate, after having gone up there 3 or 4 times, was until they changed management, they were always going to have health physics problems.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering how that looked when you got there.
Well, they were still having some problems, but I think there was things that had settled down quite a bit.
Oh, was the short little health physicist, was he up there then? What's his name? Oh, I'm trying to think. The RPM from GPU Nuclear. Mike Slobodin.
Oh, Mike? No, Mike was not there then. And of course I would have known Mike because Mike worked as an associate HP at Penn State when I was there. No, Mike had already, that would have been post TMI, I guess.
Yeah, well, Mike didn't go up there till after TMI.
Oh, that's right. It was after he left the NRC.
Yeah.
No, he wasn't there then. He must have still been with the NRC.
Okay. Well, anyway, they had a series of problems, and even so, there were health physics problems. It was obvious that if they didn't have a better attitude and management, they were going to continue to have health physics problems.
Well, I did these QA audits as part of another QA contractor, and frankly, I really didn't know enough about power plants to really do a really good audit. Although I could see, in the few days I was there, some of the problem areas and other things that they were doing.
That was a hard reactor to work on. Because the control rod drives came down from the bottom. So every time they changed those out, there was terrible explosion problems. But in any case, you certainly have had a wealth of different projects that you've worked on. You haven't just stuck to what one thinks of as the taking care of the labs and the
well, I was always interested
in
new things, and so there were always projects going on that sort of come to you if you had an interest in. I was more interested in finding out how things work and what they were doing in different areas. So the consulting was very good in that respect. It gave you lots of opportunity to do different things.
And you were certainly the health physicist of record at Penn State. I mean, you were there 30-some years. What's the biggest problem area you had when you were there?
Well, there really weren't any big problems there. As a matter of fact, my philosophy with the university program is that you're really there more as a service organization. And the university spends, at that time, we were spending a couple $100,000 a year on a health physics program. Well, if you had just let people run things themselves, 90% of the program could have taken care of itself. I mean, most experimenters didn't have enough activity to really be a significant hazard. Now, we had a reactor, and you had some irradiators, and you had some other things that were worth looking at. But by and large, unless you were getting something else out of your expenditure, really weren't getting much for the dollar that was being spin. So we try to provide service to the experimenter, the waste disposal, and helping the experimenters with a project, particularly graduate students. Getting them introduced to different ways of radiation detecting and helping them set up stuff, even going into the scrap pile and digging out stuff and helping them build things for projects. That I think was probably one of the more satisfying things, was to have a graduate student come back and thank you for helping them with a project and not being somebody who was there just policing them. And got a lot more cooperation out of them from that.
You're one of the few people that has a son that went into health physics and is now a pretty well-known health physicist on his own. Tell me about Carl.
Well, it wasn't any urging of mine. Actually, Carl went to school at Penn State in biochemistry. He talked to, I found out later he talked to Mike Slobodin. Mike was working at Penn State at that time to get information. He didn't come to his dad to get information on health physics. But he went into the Navy and wanted to be in the naval officers training after he graduated. Wanted to be a naval officer. Well, he had developed a problem with his eyes and he couldn't be a line officer, so he got out of that and went to Pitt, went through the graduate program there and came out. Worked in the Pennsylvania Bureau of Radiation Protection for a while until they had a layoff. He worked in the radon project. And so he had to find another job, and an opening came up at Johns Hopkins, and he's been there ever since, essentially doing.
I know he's very happy there.
Very similar to the work that I'm doing. And
that's amazing, isn't it?
It's it's a great deal of satisfaction to be able to say he's working in the same field, and occasionally we get to the same meetings and so forth. So that has been fortuitous. It wasn't planned, but it's really a sense of pride.
Well, it should be. It's wonderful. There aren't that many father-sons in this field. And God willing, someday I hope to interview Carl.
Okay.
And he'll probably maybe give me a little slightly different slant on how his father. Well, he must look. First of all, he looks up to you, and so from that point of view, but the thing is, you must have influenced him whether you knew it or not.
Well, I think that's about all parents can hope for, really. But I'm very proud of him and his brothers and sister also. They've all done very well.
And how many children have you?
4.
4.
Carl's the oldest. Eric, his brother, is an instructor at Penn State in Altoona. He's a mechanical engineer.
Mm-hmm.
Forrest is the youngest boy. He's a mechanical engineer for Honda in the Ohio factories. He works in their R&D department. And I have a daughter, Ingrid, the youngest. She lives in Altoona. Has a couple. We have 7 grandchildren altogether now.
Congratulations!
We've got a nice family. It's worked out very well.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, you certainly are one of the senior contributing health physicists in our society, and it's been a pleasure to be able to talk to you about your long and rich history. And I'll look forward to adding this to the archives. You'll get a copy of it and to take a look at to make sure you're happy with it. Tell me about the photographs.
Well, these are from the Saxton nuclear reactor, which was an experimental reactor built in Saxton, Pennsylvania. Kind of unusual. It was built in 1962 and ran through 72. It was about a 25 megawatt test type reactor. A lot of the early work on fuel elements. They did, it was a PWR reactor, a Westinghouse design, with the big difference was the control rods were inserted from the bottom so that they could quickly change fuel elements from the top of the reactor. But in any case, it ran there for a while, and it's in the process of decommissioning. And they came to me in about 1995, and the local, some of the local people wanted to have an inspector while they were doing the decommissioning. It had a local anti-group there. And so they asked if I would do that, and I started that while I was still working for Penn State, and have been on it since. We still have about a year to go before the decommissioning will be finished, but these pictures show, one, that the removal of the reactor core through a hole in the top of the containment vessel, and then the other picture shows a train with the reactor core, the pressurizer, and the steam generator loaded on it, starting on its journey from Saxton to Barnwell, South Carolina, where those things were taken and buried in 1998. So that's been an interesting project. Essentially, I work for Penn State, but I report to the county commissioners and work with the local citizens task force. I have full access to the site and go there about once a week and do an inspection of what's going on and report back to the citizens. So it's sort of a model for what's being used for some of the other decommissioning projects.
Right, well, you have wonderful people skills, and it really shows up here that your communication with people is so good, and with that, and with your incredible in-depth health physics knowledge and experience, that this is a perfect job for you. And I hate to tell you, but you've got work for the next 100 years just with all the decommissioning that's going to go on here in this country.
I think I'm going to be decommissioned before that.
So thank you again.
All right.